Hi, welcome to the third part of this DCP Blender beginners tutorial. So let's go ahead and open up Blender. Let's do a quick recap of where we was on part 1 and 2. So we can see the files saved here for part 1 and part 2. Now we're going to work on part 3. So let's go ahead and click on part 2 here, Blender part2.blend. And it should load up our file and we see the 3D text that we created in the previous tutorial. Let's go to File, Save As. Let's make sure that we save it as part 3. So this should be the third part of this tutorial. So let's save that. And let's just do a quick recap. I'm going to do a very fast recap of what we've done so far. So we learnt a few of the main keys that we use in Blender. We use the middle mouse button to rotate around objects. So we looked at that in part 1. We used the zoom, using the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. We looked at that in part 1 as well. We also looked at panning the image or the actual 3D viewport, holding down the shift key and using the middle mouse button to hold that down so we can pan around objects and see them from different angles. So this allows us to move around objects and see them clearly in the viewport. And we looked at the viewport, and we also looked at using the shortcut keys 1, 7, 9 and 3, and that allows us to look at the object or our viewport in the orthographic view in different views, from the front, from the top, from the bottom, and then from the right hand side. So we can look at our object and manipulate it in different ways based on the orthographic view. So we can use our middle mouse to rotate back around. And then we looked at these basic settings up here. We've got the wireframe mode, we've got the solid view, we've got look dev, which is like temporary lighting to just see what things look like, and we've got a render view. So the render view is really close to what the final render is going to look like. It's not exactly accurate, but it's very close to what our final render will look like. We also learned that pressing the number 0 on our keyboard takes us into the camera view, and in the second tutorial we looked at positioning the camera exactly where we want it to be positioned. So we looked at quite a few different things in those two tutorials. So if you haven't been through those tutorials, I'll put links to them in the YouTube description so you can follow this basic tutorial. We also looked at the move tool, so we can use the move tool to move objects around on the screen. So we've gone through some of the key fundamentals. We applied a material to the text as well, and we added a little light source, and we looked at using the bloom function. So these are some of the key basic things in Blender, and in subsequent tutorials, when we go through some more tutorials later, we'll look at things in more detail, more complex animations using particles and using fire and smoke simulations. There's so many things you can do in Blender. It's truly unbelievable, but we have to start off with the basics. So in today's tutorial, really I just want to focus on finishing off this 3 set of tutorials, and really what today we're going to look at is animating the camera, animating this text as well, and animating the lighting, and then creating our very first video render. That's very important. We want to learn how to do that. So let's think about camera position and how we might animate this camera and how we might spin this text around or do something with the text, just something really basic. And we might do something with this light source as well. We do a little basic animation with this light source. So normally in Blender, what I try and do is try and position the camera for the first frame. So where do I want my camera positioned for the first frame of this video sequence, right? So let's do one thing before we do anything else. We're going to go over to the output settings here, and in output we can choose the resolution. I would recommend that you do at least 1080p resolution videos, so we'll leave this as the default settings. These are the start and end frames, and I'll explain those in a little while. These are like our frame animations down here, how many frames we have, and the frame rate I'm going to leave it at 30 frames a second, 30 frames, and that's all I'm really going to do in the output for now. We're going to come back and look at this in a moment. So if we did some basic maths, you know, simple maths like we're running 30 frames a second. So if we've got 250 frames, how many seconds would that be? If we got open up our calculator and we did 250, normally I try and use random numbers, but 250 frames divided by 30 should give us 8.33 seconds, right? So let's just round that down to 240 frames. So we do 240 divided by 30 will give us exactly 8 seconds of animation. So let's set the end frame here. Here we can set the start frame. We're going to start always on frame 1 and we're going to end it on frame 240. So we'll type 240 in here and you see the frames will decrease. This grey bar represents how many frames are in animation. We can have thousands of frames, right? But we're going to do something quite basic at the beginning. This number 1 represents where the timeline cursor is currently positioned. So if we were to click on the right hand arrow, it will go to frame 2, frame 3 and frame 4. This is a nice easy way. We can actually left click inside here and use the mouse to left click and move across the timeline like this. You can see the blue line moving across. But we want to start our animation on frame 1, so we leave it on frame 1 here. And you'll notice in the output settings it's changed to 240 automatically because you set the end frame here to 240. So let's do something really basic, right? So the first thing we'll do is click on the camera. So we'll click on the camera, it will highlight this sort of orange color. And what we want to do is move the camera back because we want to fly the camera towards the text, and maybe we'll do a few little things in here. So let's click on the object data. And when we click on the object data, we're looking at the object data for the camera because the camera is selected right now. And the first thing we want to do is use the y-axis to move the camera back. So we want to move it back, and we want to really rotate this around and bring it down. So let's just position the text so that it's kind of like the camera is much lower, something like this. And then we're going to fly towards the text, right? So let's bring it back a bit. Let's bring it up a little bit, something like this. And maybe we'll rotate this around a bit more. Let's get it towards the sort. Let's in fact just set it to around, let's say 88 degrees. It's going to be a very flat sort of trajectory, 88 degrees. And we'll bring it down a bit, right? Something like this. And we'll bring it back a bit more. So this is going to be the very first frame. This is what the camera will see on the very first frame of the animation. We'll bring it back a little bit more as well. Let's set it to around -35. That's the first frame. So we need to tell Blender this is going to be the first frame of our animation. And the way that we do that is we hit this record button. So we're going to click on the record button. It's going to turn blue. And then what we want to do is insert a keyframe. So we want to tell Blender that this position and this rotation of the camera is going to be set in stone, think of it that way, or set as a keyframe. So to do that, we just move our mouse cursor over any of these three here. This is called the location, this is called the rotation. So we move our mouse cursor over any of these three here, and we hit the letter I. So press the letter I on your keyboard, and that inserts a keyframe. Can you see it goes orange? And down here you see a little orange dot. That represents a keyframe for the animation, for the camera in this location here. And we're going to move to the rotation and press the letter I as well. Here now we've got two keyframes set for the rotation and the location, not the scale, the location and rotation only. So we're going to move across this timeline, and we're working let's say that we're going to go around 2 seconds. Remember, we're running 30 frames a second, so on frame 60 that will be 2 second duration. So we're going to go back to the same location, and we're going to press the letter I again, I here and I here. So we've got the location and rotation. You can see this bar here is orange. That's telling us that between this keyframe and this keyframe, as far as Blender is concerned, nothing has changed in terms of the location and the rotation of the camera. But we're going to change that, and you're going to see this orange section will be removed. But make sure that blue button is still blue, right? So we're going to use the y-axis, the y location should I say, and move towards this text. Let's move towards it. And let's move it up a little bit, something like this. Let's move it up and let's rotate it a little bit. Let's rotate it down, bring it up a little bit. So we're looking down at an angle, a slight angle like this. And you can see, look, the orange bar has been removed because Blender now knows that the first frame or this first keyframe and this keyframe here are different. Let's untick the record button. Whenever we're not using the record button, we should always untick it. And then we can right click on this blue where it says 60 here. Really, this is like the timeline, so we can right click with our mouse button. So hold down the right mouse button and we can drag backwards. So that this is going to be the first part of this animation sequence. The camera is going to fly in like this, right? We can go to the first frame and click this play button, and we'll see that here. That's going to be, this is a very basic animation, right? But that's going to be the camera movement. Now while that camera is moving, we can animate the text as well. So we want to spin this text around 360 degrees while it's moving forwards in the camera. So that's a different that's a different animation. So we're going to click on the text here, click on text right here, and we're going to do something very similar. So we're going to hit the record button, we're going to go to the location and rotation here, right? And on the location we're going to press the letter I, and on the rotation we're going to press the letter I as well. Then we're going to move to that same position, frame 60, right here. And we're going to press the letter I here and the letter I here. And all we want to do now is tell Blender, we don't really want to move the location. So we don't really need to set a keyframe in there. But as kind of default, I'll do that anyway. But it's the rotation that we want to change. And we want to rotate it on this blue axis, which is the Z axis. So we're going to tell Blender to rotate this let's spin it this direction. In fact, let's spin it the other way. So we're going to spin it 360. So we can just click in here and type in 360. 360. So if we untick the record button and we go backwards, now Blender is going to move the camera forward and the text is going to rotate 360 degrees during this animation sequence. Here we can see it, right? So when the camera stops here, we want to go to frame 90. Let's give it a bit more. So that's 1 second, right? Let's go to frame 100 here, and we're going to hit the record button. And what we're going to do is go, in fact, what we're going to do is use this little button here, and that jumps right back to the first frame, this one here. So we'll click that, and that takes us back to the first frame. And we're going to take this light source. So let's click on the light source here. We'll click on that light source, and we're going to drag it outside of the camera view. We want it outside the camera view. And we're going to move our mouse. We're going to right click on this timeline and go to frame 60. That's where everything is done. On frame 60, the animation is finished of spinning and moving the camera forward. And what we'll do is we will move to our timeline here, and what we'll do is click on the light object here, and we'll press the letter I and the letter I here. So we're going to insert a keyframe here and here. The first keyframe was already set because we moved it at the beginning. Do you remember we moved it away? As soon as you move something in Blender while the record button is on, it's going to create a keyframe automatically there for it. So we're going to use the mouse wheel to zoom out a little bit. So rotate out a little bit. That's zooming out on the viewport, nothing to do with the animation. We can zoom in and out using our mouse wheel. So we're going to zoom out so that we can see this object over here, basically, right? Over here. This is the light source. So on frame 60, we don't really want to do anything. But on frame 100, so we're going to move across to frame 100. In fact, what we might do is let's experiment here. So on frame 60, what we're going to do is drag this light source so that it stops in the middle of this object here, right here. Then we're going to move to frame, let's say frame 100, and all we'll do is just drag the light source out of the scene here, like this. It's going to insert a keyframe automatically for that. So we can zoom back in, that we can see everything, and we can untick the record button, go back to the first frame, and we can click on the camera. So this is what the camera sees, right here. And we can go back to the first frame and click play. In fact, let's pause that. Sometimes you end up clicking this backwards play button, so be careful. So go back to the first frame, click here, and then click the forwards play button. So we'll click forwards, the text will rotate around, and you can see this light source flow across it. So let's go back and do that one more time. Here, like this. Right, and that doesn't quite look right for me. So what's wrong here, I think, is let's hit that record button again. Let's go back to the light source. So we can see the light source being animated, right? It moves in and then it flows across this text. But it will probably be better that it flows across the whole. In fact, let's make it flow backwards in the opposite direction. So let's go to frame 100. Let's click on that record button, and then we'll go to frame 130, and we'll zoom out a little bit so we can click on this red arrow. And we're going to drag this light source all the way back across again to this side. So the light will go from this side to this side and come back again as well. So let's untick the record button, click this backwards arrow here to go to the first frame, and we'll click the play button again. Let's click this play button. So the text will animate, the camera will move in, it will flow here, then it will flow across again like this. And sometimes that flowing across was a bit quick. So what we can do is click on this keyframe here where my mouse is, click on it, left click on it, and drag it across. And we're going to drag it across to, let's say, frame 150, frame 150. Let's click the arrow back to the first frame and click the play button one more time, and it will flow across this way, and it will flow across this way. So the camera is very static during that animation. You can see the camera does some movement between frame 1 and frame 60, but from frame 60 all the way to frame 150, the camera doesn't do anything. So let's make the camera do something during that sequence, just a basic movement, right? So we'll click on the camera here, we'll click on the record button, and we can see between frame 60 and a frame 100 there's no keyframe here. So let's press the letter I here and the letter I here for the location and rotation. And what we will do is we will basically, there's a couple of ways to do this, right? But for now, I'm going to show you the slightly easier way. So we'll click on object here, camera, object, click I here and I here to insert a keyframe. And what we'll do is move the camera on the X location. We're going to move it to the side a little bit like this. And then we're going to rotate it, not on the Y, we're going to rotate it on the Z. So we're going to rotate it around and then move it on the X axis so that it's kind of at an angle like this, you see? And then on the Y, we want to move it forward. Let's move it on the X so it's sitting somewhere like here. So let's see what happens now, right? So our camera will move across and it's going to move to this sort of angle, and it's a bit more dramatic, right? It looks a bit better than just having it static. And I think we can get a bit closer to this text. So on the Y we'll move forward and on the X we'll move to the side, and on the Z we'll move it up a little bit. You just got to play around with this to get the text centered out nicely. So hit the record button when you're happy, and you can just right click on here and just move the timeline to see what that's going to look like. And here you go. So this is really a real basic sort of animation that we're doing in Blender. There's much more complex stuff that we can do, but I want you to learn the basics first, and you can then go and experiment with this animation. You can spin the text around many times, you can do all sorts of stuff, right? You can experiment, but I want you to learn the basics first, and then in future tutorials we'll do much more complex stuff. We can have particles flowing out, we can do really crazy stuff, crazy animations, really sort of spectacular stuff, but understanding the basics first is very important. So let's make this into a real video now. So I'm quite happy with that, and we didn't use all 240 frames. Can you see we only used 150 of them? So let's set the end frame to 150. There's no point in rendering out frames where nothing's going to happen at the end. So it'll be quicker to render out these 150 frames here. Let's go to File, Save. Let's go to the output settings. Let's see, actually in the render settings first, in the render and the viewport, these are like the samples. So in the samples here, I'm going to set it to, let's say 90 for now. Normally I'll increase this a little bit higher than 90 in the render, but for now 90 should be fine because it will render out quite quick, and there's nothing really that spectacular going on in this animation. There's no particles, there's no flames, there's nothing of real, that requires real high render settings. So 90 should be fine here. The viewport set at 16 should be fine, but normally I'll increase this to around 60, but that's inside this viewport. It's not at the final render. The final render will use 90 samples, right? So we'll go to the output, and in the output we're going to leave all of our settings. It's set to 150 frames because we decreased it here to 150. In the output we're going to go to this PNG where it's written PNG here. We're going to set it to AVI JPEG. AVI JPEG there, AVI JPEG. We're going to leave it on RGB. We're going to leave it at 90% quality, which is fine. We'll click on this little folder icon here. It's going to take us to a temp directory. We don't want to go to the temp. We're going to go to the desktop, go to our Blender folder, and we're just going to click accept here, accept. Now to render out the final animation, we need to be on the first frame, which is fine. And we're going to go to render and then render animation, or we can just click Control and F12. Try and remember that shortcut, Control F12, and we'll just click here. Now Blender's going to take each one of the frames. You can see frame 3, frame 4, 5, 6, 7. It's going to do 150 of these frames, and it's going to stitch them all together, and it's going to run it at the end at 150 frames a second. This is going to take a little bit of time to complete. It's not going to take too long, but I'm going to pause the video, and while it's rendering out all of these frames, we'll come back and look at the final animation once it's rendered out all of these frames. So let me pause the video now. Okay, so that took a few minutes to complete, and Blender's finished rendering out all of the frames. You can see frame 150 here, and it took a total of like 1 minute basically to do all of that work. It took around a minute, just over a minute to do that. So let's close this down, and we'll open up Blender again, and always go to File, Save, and we'll close down Blender, and we'll open up this folder, and inside this folder you're going to find an AVI file. So here you can see this AVI file. That's the one that's been rendered out just now. So let's open that and check it. I'll leave it looping. So let's put it on, let's try and set that to loop. Let's see, repeat. And we'll click play, and we'll just see what's going on here. So you can see Blender's got the lighting effect going on. So we're using the Eevee render engine to do this. It's a very basic 3D text animation, but within, let's say, almost an hour, you've gone from not really knowing Blender to be able to do something like this. Is quite good. And in future tutorials, we'll be able to do much more complex animations. We can have particles flowing out of here. We can do all sorts of stuff. We can have reflections, and there's loads and loads of stuff that we can do in Blender. We can have smoke effects and lots of different things. But as a basic sort of animation, this is really a good place for you to start with. You've learned quite a lot in this tutorial. You should have learned how to manage the camera, how to keyframe, how to set up 3D text, how to give it some depth and some dimension to the text, how to add a bevel, how to animate the light, how to add a light source. So many different things you've learned in this tutorial. How to navigate Blender, how to navigate the viewport. Quite a lot of things we've been through just in this basic set of tutorials. So really, this was all about getting you up to speed and getting you going through and understanding some basics. So my advice is, and if you've got the time, try and go through this tutorial a few times so you get up to speed with the basic shortcuts. Because you know, the better you know those shortcuts, like how to rotate objects, how to change their scale. We didn't really look at scale too much in this tutorial. We should have really looked at it a little bit, but I won't worry about that because we're going to go through many more tutorials, and I'm going to try and explain things in really basic terms. I want you to be able to understand that, because I'll see a lot of tutorials on Blender on YouTube, and they're quite hard to understand, and you know, people are not breaking it down in basic terms. They're explaining it from a 3D animator's terms, or someone that really knows Blender quite well. They're not really explaining it to someone that doesn't know Blender at all. So I want you to learn and understand how Blender works. Okay, so I hope you find this set of tutorials very useful, and I'll be making many more, so do subscribe to the YouTube channel. This is going to be a dedicated channel just to Blender 3D, and you can go to my main channel where you can find at least another 360 videos. Some of them are on Blender. They're on a wide range of subject areas. So if you check the description, you'll find the link to my main channel, DCP channel on YouTube, where you'll find hundreds and hundreds of tutorials on a wide range of subjects. Okay, let's close this down. I hope you find this very useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next DCP web tutorial.